From Canada, Citizens Forum, where we look at the important issues of the day through a lens of democracy and media and try to figure out, how do we build a better country for ourselves? Hello, welcome to From Canada, Citizens Forum. It is Tuesday, November the 18th, 2025. My name is Jack Etkin. I'm in Victoria, BC, and my guest in this segment is Marc Lee. Marc's in Vancouver. And Marc is a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which is, I believe, a left-wing think tank focusing on economic and environmental issues. Marc has been heavily involved with energy policy, affordable housing issues, and federal and provincial budgets. He has a master's in economics from Simon Fraser University, and he was a visiting professor there in 2024, early 2025. So you may agree or disagree with Marc, but he has expertise in his field. And I've always personally liked the CCPA, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, because I find their work to be kind of coming from the place where I'm at and always interesting and informative. So thank you for joining us, Marc.
All right, thanks for having me on, Jack.
So let's get started. Yesterday was the final vote on the first Mark Carney Liberal budget. Can you tell us what was in yesterday's budget and how does it work for lower income Canadians and those suffering the most from the high cost of living?
Sure. I mean, well, the short answer is not much. I think what we've seen so far over 2025 is that most of the political and economic drama has played out against the backdrop of President Trump and trade. And that's really dominated the discourse. Arguably that's what brought Mark Carney to the Liberal leadership and allowed him to win the election as the person who is best positioned to negotiate or defend Canada's interests relative to President Trump. Since then, we've heard a lot of talk from the Prime Minister. And quite frankly, I kind of like the talk. I think he's a very good communicator, because he's a central banker from Canada and the United Kingdom, a rarity, the governor of two central banks. One of the primary things that they like to do is command the confidence of the financial markets and the business community and foreign investors, that sort of thing. So I think we've seen a lot of talk aimed at projecting confidence to the world, communicating that we have a strategy when confronted with this existential crisis with President Trump. But unfortunately, the reality on the ground, as someone who pays close attention to this stuff, is that it's a lot more mixed. So in the summertime, the big conversation was interprovincial barriers to trade, and that the federal government is going to sweep these away, and this is going to lead to $200 billion of new economic growth. Well, we've been looking at this issue for a number of years, and really there are very, very few barriers to trade within Canada. There are some differences in regulation, but ultimately there's not $200 billion that someone has just forgotten to clean up off of the ground. Similarly, with the idea of major projects and infrastructure, a lot of we're going to connect Canada from coast to coast with these new nation building projects. And then really all we've got so far is a number of liquefied natural gas and mining projects, Canada doubling down on its traditional role as a resource exporter. We haven't seen anything that's about connecting Canada through high-speed rail or an east-west electricity grid and that kind of thing. So flash forward to the budget. I mean, really, this is the first chance that we've had to see a more detailed blueprint from this prime minister and this federal government since the election, getting beyond the rhetoric. And when you actually put dollars to your commitments. It shows you what your real commitments are as a nation. And in the lead up to the budget, we had a lot of talk about generational investments. And then when the budget came out, it was like, we're going to, this is going to bring $1 trillion of new investment to Canada over the next 5 years. But if you peer through the pages, there's not actually all that much there. A lot of the federal commitment is money that was already on the books under Prime Minister Trudeau. A lot of the private investment relies not so much on governments getting its act together and accelerating approvals and, streamlining regulation and cutting red tape. It's that private sector players haven't made multi-billion-dollar decisions at their board tables to invest in these big mega projects that the government is championing. So a lot of the oxygen in the room has been around big resource mega projects, arguably with the intent of moving those to other markets than the United States. And I think at the end of the day, it's kind of underwhelming that, we haven't had a vision of the Canada that we want to build. Like the rhetoric of elbows up is something that I think Canadians can rally behind. We've talked about, expanding our trade relationships with other countries and developing our country, but we're not really seeing a budget that does any of that in a really big way. In fact, the new investment commitments from the federal government are actually quite modest over the course of a 5-year fiscal plan. So I feel like this government is getting a reputation of over-promising and under-delivering. And, while I think Prime Minister Carney has been a good communicator and certainly a much better communicator than the leader of the Conservative Party would have been had the election gone in a different direction, it's still kind of disappointing in the sense that the investments we're talking about in this budget are really about the old Canadian economy of the 20th century, maybe even the 19th century. Big resource development for export. The classic Canadian conundrums around how do we start with those staples industries and then develop more value-added industries on the top of those, or to diversify our mix, has kind of been left by the wayside. And similarly, the conversation about how we need to reorient our investment away from new investments in fossil fuels, which are causing climate change and all of the costly damages we're seeing in Canada and around the world, shifting away from fossil fuels and shifting towards renewables and clean tech and all of that kind of stuff. So that has also been left by the wayside. And if anything, the government of Canada has been backtracking on its climate commitments. 10 years after signing on to the Paris Agreement, the world's not first, but most important attempt at addressing global climate change. So I think overall it's disappointing. It's like trade issues with the United States are being used as a pretext to launch a whole bunch of projects that are in the interests of private investors in areas like oil and gas and mining.
Thank you very much, Mark. Let me ask you a few questions about what you've just said. First of all, you mentioned that there really aren't that many barriers to free trade in Canada. It's not that big a deal, and not all the hundreds of millions and billions of dollars in savings. And yet that idea was pushed by the media as a huge thing that was wrong with Canada. And yet you're saying something quite different. I mean, the media really told us that this is a big problem. You're saying it's not that big a problem. Can you just comment a bit more on that?
Well, I mean, I'd throw the question back to you. Like, can you identify any situations where there are barriers to trade, where you personally have experienced a barrier purchasing something from another province? Certainly, there are some restrictions in alcohol because provinces have provincial liquor distribution monopolies, and they determine what goes on the shelves of those stores. But that's really the only area where there are bona fide barriers to trade. There are a few other areas that get thrown around where there's some differences between, for example, in food for meat and slaughterhouses, where there are provincial slaughterhouses and then there's a federal regime. So if you're certified to the federal regime, you can export anywhere in Canada and anywhere in the rest of the world. But if you're only certified under the provincial regime, then you can't automatically export your product to another province. But it's an easily solvable problem. Really, what this whole thing is about is that there are some differences in regulation from province to province. Usually these have to do with environmental standards, consumer protection, health and safety protections for workers. And, there are some differences there. And in some cases, they don't make any difference, and we could harmonize those or move to some other system. But for the vast majority of the time, there are no barriers preventing goods traveling from one province to another, or people from delivering services from one to the other, or workers packing up and moving to a different province and being able to practice their profession. A lot of this stuff is just completely made up. There's some big numbers being thrown around that are largely stemming from the studies of one or two people in Canada using a methodology that we've looked at more closely, and that basically doesn't even really measure actual trade barriers. It just comes up with sort of a modeling exercise, a thought experiment, and then tries to attribute a bunch of numbers to that. And a lot of caveats and qualifications and assumptions going into that, and a whole range of results at the outset of that literature. And yet the media sort of picks it up, and politicians pick it up, and sort of like instantly claim that the highest end of that range, based on a whole bunch of wacky assumptions, is actually something that we can bank on. That if we just do these things, we'll get that money right away. Even if we did everything that they were saying, there's no guarantee that any of this stuff is going to happen.
I'm not a big fan of Canada's what I call corporate-owned media, but I'm still surprised that they created, out of, you're saying basically thin air, this huge story that they just told us over and over again how backwards we were and how we were failing everything by not having, and yet you're saying that these barriers to trade don't really exist. So I find that very interesting. Thank you for bringing it up.
Well, if I can just add that, there were more differences back in, before the 1980s and early 1990s. So back in 1995, the Canadian provinces and the federal government signed what was called the Agreement on Internal Trade. And it was intended to have, common rules and harmonize trade.
But that was 30 years ago.
Province, largely to make sure that those were compatible with the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and then the North American Free Trade Agreement. In 2017, that process was revisited again and reaffirmed in what's called the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. And I bet most people out there have never heard of the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. And certainly of all the people who think that there's $200 billion of gains to be had, probably most of them have not heard of the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. So this has already been in place for a large number of times. So basically, the vast majority of Canadian goods and services and people can move without any barriers. There are some areas where there are differences, and in some cases, those could be harmonized. In other cases, not. So, for example, in British Columbia, we have mountains and valleys on our roads. So the standards we have for trucking are much more stringent than the standards they have in Saskatchewan, where, surprise, surprise, the roads are pretty flat. So if you all of a sudden said, oh, every truck that's certified in Saskatchewan now has the right to drive in BC, what do you think is going to happen? I think there's going to be accidents. There's going to be trucks flying over Kicking Horse Canyon and injuries associated with that. So in some cases, there are legitimate differences for having differences in regulation from one province to another, because different provinces have different geology, different ecosystems, different resources, different populations, different conditions that they're dealing with. And that's the whole point of having provinces, is to be able to make decisions that reflect the needs and interests of local people. Otherwise, why have provinces at all? Like, I asked some of the authors of this internal trade stuff, like, if you believe that there's all these gains to be had from harmonization, why have provinces? Like, what's the rationale for having provinces at all? And usually people have a blank stare and can't answer the
what can
question.
you do? You mentioned that this is the largest deficit in Canadian history that Mr. Carney is ringing up outside of the COVID years. So there's a huge deficit. You're saying the budget is underwhelming. What's happening then? And what kind of budget would you like to see? How would you like to see what is obviously a very, very large amount of money being spent? Because one thing they're doing is they're cutting programs, and I don't even know what that means, and instead spending the money on these great national projects, which, as you kind of suggested, are the 20th century and even the 19th century.
Well, I mean, I think as a starting point, I'm not overly concerned about having a higher deficit. And yes, the deficit is higher than it was anticipated to be a year ago. But you also have to put it in the context of Canada's, $3.2 trillion economy, right? So we live in this world of growth. The numbers always get bigger year upon year after year. Like, education spending is always bigger one year to the next. Healthcare spending is always bigger one year to the next. But we always benchmark that relative to the size of the economy. So at the end of the day, what matters for federal finances is the cost of servicing its debt. And that's a reflection on interest rates, but also the level of debt relative to GDP, or what economists call the debt to GDP ratio. So our debt to GDP ratio this year is about 42%. It's projected to increase to 43% within 2 years and then stay level there. So basically, we're increasing the total dollar value of debt, but as the economy is growing. But the level of debt relative to the size of the economy is basically staying the same. So if we were talking about like generational investments, where we need to pivot away from the United States, we need to make big fundamental changes, we need to do all of these things, we should be seeing higher levels of debt relative to GDP, because we'd be borrowing more money to make investments that are strengthening our economy and improving it for the new context that we're in. The other piece is that I think there's a little bit of leftover deficit hysteria from the 1990s. I said Canada's current debt to GDP ratio is 42%. Back in 1995, when we had the landmark Paul Martin budget that launched, budget cuts and was largely aimed at bringing down that debt to GDP ratio, the debt to GDP ratio that year was like 67%. Okay, so that's a lot bigger than 42%. So the 42% is more like where Canada was in the early 1980s. So, at some point, we may be concerned about Canada's debt relative to GDP. And certainly we would be concerned if we were borrowing that money and just kind of squandering it, building like palaces for for rich people, or just burying that money and having no impact whatsoever. But that's not the case. So I think there was a lot more potential for the government to live up to its rhetoric of generational investments. But, what we got is a lot more rhetoric and less actual action on the ground. Now, the other part you're talking about was around spending cuts. And this was something that we were very concerned about in the lead up to it. And here's how it breaks down. A lot of what the federal government does is transfer money around. So it transfers money to individuals through things like old age security, and to families through child benefits. Those were not cut. We transfer money to provinces for healthcare and post-secondary education and social services. Those weren't cut either. So both of those big categories of federal spending, which is about half of the federal budget, will continue to grow as planned. There were no cuts there. Where there have been cuts is in the rest of what are the kind of the main federal department areas. And what we actually see within those is a shift and a reallocation of money towards defense and border security and away from like softer social servicey sort of things. And so this could be, immigration and passports or employment programs or foreign aid. We don't really know exactly what that's going to look like. There's not enough information in the budget to give the detail on that, but we know that this is going to inevitably lead to cuts in programs and in staff. And so in staff, we're looking at about a 10% reduction in the federal public service by the end of year 3. And in terms of programs, I think what's likely to happen is that a lot of programs that are funded and on the books that will expire next year or the year after that will simply be allowed to run their course, and then they'll roll off the books and they won't be refinanced. So an example of that is like what we're doing with electric vehicle subsidies. Now, I mean, there's a whole debate to be had about whether electric vehicle subsidies are a good thing or a bad thing. But we had money that was allocated to that. That money's been drawn down. In a normal course of things, that would be replenished in the budget, but it's not. So we're basically winding down that subsidy program. Similar with things like heat pumps or any other programs that are available to Canadians.
So if we're cutting in certain areas and still running a record deficit, where is the money being spent? And you mentioned defense, or the military. I shouldn't say defense, I'd say the military. And I assume that money is being directed towards also LNG, ports, infrastructure to support mining, logging, oil, and natural gas, which isn't natural. But so what do you think of how the money is being spent, and how would you like to do it differently?
Well, at CCPA, we do an annual publication called the Alternative Federal Budget. And folks can look that up. It's pretty easy to find online. And there we basically, outline what we would do department by department. And what that all totals up to in terms of the budget and the outlook and the economic impact that would have, the impacts on poverty and different groups. So I think there are alternative ways of doing this. At some point, though, I think we need to ask questions on the tax side as well as the spending side. All the politicians want to deliver tax cuts. No one wants to talk about tax increases, and so we cut the carbon tax, and that was the latest version of that. But we have a major inequality problem in Canada. I think there's a lot of concentration of income and wealth at the very top of the pyramid. And we should be looking at taxes to raise revenue and to address that inequality.
Would you like to see a wealth tax? And also, the Trudeau government was talking about increasing the tax rate on capital gains. Now, capital gains are the way I think that the wealthiest Canadians make a lot of their money. And capital gains are only taxed at, for example, if you work and make $100,000 a year, then on your tax form, you write down $100,000 a year to start, $100,000 of income to start off. But if you make that same $100,000 in capital gains, you start off writing down $50,000, or somehow half of it disappears. So it's a huge tax benefit for those who make their money through capital gains. And the wealthiest Canadians make the most of money out of capital gains. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so just to clarify the concept a little bit, capital gains are income from the sale of assets. So if you buy your home and then you live in it for a while and you sell it for double the price, then that increase is your capital gain.
But if it's your own home, it's not taxed, right?
Yeah, but it's still a capital gain. So I'm getting to that part.
Okay.
And similarly, if you're selling other financial assets like stocks and bonds, for example, the gains on that are capital gains. What we do in Canada is that you only have to include half of your capital gain as income for tax purposes. And the proposal under the Trudeau government that got quashed essentially was that above a certain amount, then you would have to include 75% of those gains. So there's still a privilege, a benefit to capital income, but it's reduced for the people at the very top. So I think it was a very modest step. We used to have 75% capital gains inclusion when Mulroney was prime minister. Remember conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. So, and a lot of this has been the idea that if we lower the tax rates on capital, that we will get more investment, and this will lead to economic growth and increases in productivity, and this will close the gap between Canada and the United States and all of these great things. It just hasn't worked out that way. And so to me, it doesn't make sense that, if you work at a job hour after hour, week after week to make $100,000, and then another person
or $40,000.
Another person is just sitting at home and owns financial assets and sells them at the end of the year for the same $100,000 gain. I'm just using $100,000 because it's a convenient round number. They should be basically paying the same tax, and this is a principle in the tax literature. They call it horizontal equity. So it's the idea that a buck is a buck is a buck for the purposes of taxation. And why should the income made predominantly by the wealthiest people in society basically get taxed at a much lower rate? So I think, again, we're going to have to revisit that. It was a good move from the Trudeau government. There was a huge backlash against it, a lot of misinformation, and the wealthy won that particular battle. To your question about a wealth tax, 100%. We should definitely have a wealth tax, and the federal government is the right level of government to implement that, because they can prevent people shifting things around province to province, and could implement it uniformly. To some extent, we already have a bit of a wealth tax in the form of property taxation, which is largely sort of local and provincial, but making that more coherent and adding financial assets, which is where a lot of the real inequality comes from, the ownership of stocks in particular. You could have like a base that would form a relatively straightforward way of wealth taxation. I'm not saying that's going to be politically easy, but I think if you actually designed it in a way that you weren't affecting the vast majority of households, and you were simply just asking people who were already extremely privileged in society, the very top of the distribution, to pay more through a wealth tax, then maybe we could pass it.
Well, we've never done it. We haven't done it yet. And I don't think the people who are at the top are ever going to let us do it, because, the people with the money, I think, are the ones who really seem to run this country. And the last thing they want is a wealth tax. I was very surprised the Trudeau government brought forward this idea of increasing the taxation on capital gains. Do you have any idea of why they did that?
I don't know the backstory on it. No.
Okay. I'd like to talk a little bit about housing and the cost of living. The housing thing is new. I grew up in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and we never had anything like this. And then, houses were something you bought to live in. And then suddenly 20 years ago, that began to change, more than 20 years ago, really. And now we've created this absolute disaster for millions of Canadians, to the point where we hear that people can barely afford to eat, and the cost of buying a home is increasingly out of control. So I'd like you to comment on why you think it happened and also what are the solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, a lot of this goes back to the mid 1990s. I already referenced that landmark Paul Martin 1995, budget, and that was when the federal government got out of the housing game in a big way. So up to that point, through the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the early 90s, we had a lot of federal involvement in the development of affordable housing. Some of that was on the tax side. We had a more generous tax provisions for building rental housing, and they changed those because ended up being a bit of a tax shelter for dentists and healthcare professionals who had a lot of money to park away. But it did actually lead to a lot of rental housing getting built, and then the federal government partnered. Around social housing with the provinces and local governments and churches and other nonprofits. So a lot of the affordable housing stock that's still around today in co-ops and non-market housing stems from that period. And then we basically stopped building that housing, which I think was really core to low and middle income households being able to keep a roof over their heads. Um, and then since then, there's been various dribs and drabs, mostly tinkering on the margins, a little bit of money for homelessness prevention and shelters and that kind of thing. In 2017, the federal government brought in a national housing strategy, and we had sort of some parallel things happening here in BC. But a lot of it sort of got twisted in different ways. A lot of the federal money went into low interest loans for private sector developers of rental housing. They had to meet some affordability tests, but it wasn't a very high bar in terms of meeting the affordability. And really, what has not been done at the federal or provincial levels is a meaningful investment in this non-market housing. And for me, the essence of it is non-market housing. Because when you have a private sector model, if they're building rental housing, they're building housing that's always going to rent at whatever the market rent is, and then you'll have maybe some rent control comes in, and there's always going to be incentive to evict tenants so that you can jack up your rents to whatever the market rent is. Whereas in a nonprofit model, you just need to break even. So you need to cover your costs. You have monthly maintenance and operations costs, and then you have the cost of the upfront build of the place, the cost of land and construction to build the building in the first place. But you basically can amortize that over 30, or more years. So basically, with non market housing or nonprofit housing, that break-even rent ends up being lower because right off the top, you're taking out developer or landlord profits out of the equation. So I think that's the type of model we should be investing in. The federal government is actually talking about doing some of that. They've announced a new Build Canada Homes program, which will activate federally owned land and put that on the table and bring to bear some of these other mechanisms. They have a model where they would like to have more modularized construction, so sort of panels and other components built off site and then assembled on site, as opposed to the traditional way of building housing, but also building these houses to the highest sort of energy efficiency standards. So I really like this model, but this comes back to why the budget was underwhelming, is that the budget didn't do very much. Like it's talked about this great grand program and the massive needs and hundreds of thousands of units that we need. And so far, all we have on the books is a plan to start with 4,000 housing units in 2026. And then after that, who knows? So really, this program needs to scale up, in a big way. We estimate through the alternative federal budget that we should be building 1 million of these kind of units over the course of a decade. So 100,000 per year. When we're starting with 4,000, again, it's a good start, and maybe it grows and becomes the full blown deal. But even in the budget, they only allocated about half of what they were talking about for that. So again, it feels like a lost opportunity not to do more, given that they had the wind at their backs, and a lot of public opinion sort of saying, yes, we want these generational investments. We want this government to get to roll up its sleeves and address these major concerns we have around housing and affordability. And, they made some tentative first steps, and we should give them credit for that, but there's still so much more to be done.
I'm kind of disappointed that at the picture you're painting here, because it seems doable, and it's a crisis. And so where is the money being spent in this most recent federal? If it's not being spent on that, and they're cutting billions out of programs, certain programs, then why are we running a record deficit? Where is money being spent in this budget?
Well, I mean, like I said, half of federal expenditures are going to benefits to individuals and benefits to provinces that support social programs. But we also have to talk. There is some money for paying interest on the existing federal debt, so that costs a little bit of money. And then we have various federal departments of all different stripes, and within that, there's been a bit of a reallocation to increase the budget for defense and border security and reduce the budgets in these other areas. I mean, that is basically the totality of the federal government within that.
Last question. Oil industry subsidies. I think they are in the neighborhood of $25 to $30 billion a year. Am I in the ballpark if I say that?
That sounds a little high. They're different groups and organizations
have
define subsidies differently. And, in a lot of cases, this is not the government cuts a check to, Enbridge or, Transpound or some other company. It's more that they have breaks on royalties or taxation, special tax treatment, and that sort of thing. And also they provide low-cost financing for big companies who don't really need it to basically, pad their export sales. So a lot of that money, they call them subsidies, but it's not money that you can just claim and say, I'm ending the subsidies and I'm going to spend that all on healthcare. It's more like it's money that's predicated on investment taking place. So it's kind of like if you go and buy something at a store and it's on sale and it's 30% off, you get the you save that money, but you don't get to have access to the 30% that you saved and spend it somewhere else in the store. So that's kind of the key difference on that. But still, yeah, we shouldn't be subsidizing the oil and gas industry. We built a $34 billion pipeline from northern Alberta to the BC coast, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, which just opened last year. And so far, it feels like the federal government is not going to be putting that same kind of money on the table for a second pipeline from Alberta to the northern BC coast, which Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, wants to resuscitate, which would be basically similar to what was proposed about 15 years ago, the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline. Although it may not be that particular company and that particular thing, but that's the same general idea. So I think the overall challenge, to take a step back, is that we still have this resource extraction mentality in Canada, and we seem to care more about oil and gas exports and production than we do about climate change and energy transition. And for a while under Trudeau, we were sort of trying to have it both ways. We had climate plans on the one hand, but we also had oil and gas expansion on the other hand. And with Prime Minister Carney, it seems like we're jettisoning the climate portions to a greater extent. Although, apparently Elizabeth May won a concession in exchange for her vote that Carney promised that he would meet our Paris climate targets. But how much that commitment is worth is I don't not willing to speculate on.
Yeah, right. Mark, is there anything you'd like to say to people watching this just about the state of the country or the directions we're going in or solutions to the issues that we face?
Well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we are spending a lot of time doubling down on what Canada has always done, extract resources for export markets. And a lot of the emphasis has been on how do we, encourage more private sector investment in all of these areas on the presumption that this is going to be, beneficial to everyone. Whereas I think, what we've tried to do at CCPA and in our alternative federal budget is to sort of talk about, well, what do Canadians need? What's the infrastructure Canadians need to have a higher quality of life? I would love to see a national program that eradicates homelessness. I'd love to see a national program that builds a high-speed rail network across this country, and linking that to massive investments in local public transit. Like we could have essentially zero carbon mobility that would displace people's reliance on the private automobile. I'd love to see an east-west electricity grid. So I feel like there are big visionary things that do what the government says it would do, that tie the country together, that bring Canadians closer together, that are a national project that Canadians can rally behind. But so far, what we're seeing from the federal government doesn't give you a whole lot. There's no moonshot there. We're not swinging for the fences. It's almost kind of status quo. And I feel like when Mark Carney goes to speak, he says a lot of the right words, but when we come to the budget and the actual dollars and cents that they're backing that by, there's a pretty big gap between the rhetoric and reality.
Mark Lee,
The other Mark.
Yeah. Of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Thank you very much. I'd say I found this fascinating and very, very interesting, and a lot of information that is kind of different than the information we so often get from the regular media. Thank you very, very much.
Well, don't believe everything you read, and please visit us at the CCPA.
Yes, exactly. Can you just we should throw this on a few times. What's your website?
So it's just policyalternatives.ca. We'll take you there. We produce so much stuff, provincially, federally, on all of the big topics that people are concerned about in public policy, and they're all available for free. If you like what we're doing or like us being out there in the media talking about progressive ideas and keeping them alive in the public debate, we'd also appreciate your financial support, because we are a supporter-driven organization.
Right. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Jack. Take care.